7 cosmic horror dimensions that should not exist. That is what we are here to examine today, and I chose every word of that title carefully. Not 7 fictional places, not 7 imaginary realms. 7 dimensions that, according to every model of reality we trust, should not exist. The distinction matters. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? I ask because what we are about to discuss has an unusual relationship with location, not with any specific place on a map, but with the concept of place itself, with the assumption that the space around you is stable, consistent, and safe. In 1928, a reclusive writer from Providence, Rhode Island, described a sunken city whose geometry was, in his words, all wrong. The angles did not behave as angles should. Surfaces appeared convex and concave at the same time. Sailors who walked its streets could not determine whether they were climbing or descending. That writer was H.P. Lovecraft, and that city, Relier, was only the beginning. Over the following decades, Lovecraft and a loose circle of correspondents did something no literary movement had done before. They collaboratively mapped a network of impossible places, dimensions where time has corners, plateaus that exist in 3 locations simultaneously, a court at the center of all reality, occupied by a blind, mindless God. Spaces between spaces where things that should not exist have always been watching. Most people who encounter cosmic horror remember the monsters, but scholars of the genre have long understood something worse. The monsters can be avoided. The dimensions cannot, because they were here first, and we built our reality on top of them without knowing what was underneath. 7 dimensions. 7 violations of everything physics, philosophy, and human sanity depend on. And here is what should genuinely unsettle you. At least 3 of them were described in fiction before modern science. Began detecting evidence of something remarkably, uncomfortably similar. The walls of your room meet at right angles. After today, you may wish they didn't. The most terrifying idea in the history of horror literature is not a creature. It is a place. More precisely, it is the suspicion that the space around us, the geometry we navigate, the dimensions we inhabit, might be wrong. Not haunted, not cursed, not populated by malevolent spirits, but fundamentally, structurally incorrect in ways that human cognition was never equipped to process. This suspicion predates H.P. Lovecraft. But Lovecraft was the first writer to build an entire cosmology around it, and the writers who followed him expanded that cosmology into something unprecedented, a collaboratively authored geography of impossible spaces. Lovecraft's personal correspondence reveals a mind preoccupied less with monsters than with architecture. In letters to Clark Ashton Smith throughout the late 1920s, he returned obsessively to the idea that alien civilizations might construct environments according to geometric principles hostile to human perception. His letters to August Derleth from the same period describe dreams of cities whose angles did not behave as angles should, a phrase that would find its way, almost verbatim, into The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. Lovecraft did not begin with creatures and then build worlds for them to inhabit. He began with spaces that felt wrong, and then asked what kind of entities such spaces might produce. He was not working in isolation. The tradition of dimensional horror, spaces that violate the rules governing normal reality, extends back at least to Ambrose Bierce's The Damned Thing, 1893. In which a creature exists in a color the human eye cannot perceive. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, which Lovecraft considered the finest supernatural tale in English literature, describes a riverside location where another dimension presses against our own so forcefully that the physical landscape begins to deform. Lovecraft admired both writers, but where Bierce suggested a single hidden frequency and Blackwood evoked a single thin place, Lovecraft envisioned an entire atlas of wrong spaces. Multiple dimensions, each violating reality in a different and specific way. The intellectual context matters enormously. Einstein's general theory of relativity, published in 1915 and widely popularized throughout the 1920s, demonstrated that space itself could curve, warp, and behave in ways that contradicted everyday intuition. Lovecraft was not a physicist, but he read popular accounts of relativity with intense interest. What he extracted was not scientific understanding, but something more useful for his purposes, a vocabulary. If space could curve, then perhaps it could curve in directions hostile to human consciousness. If time was not absolute, then perhaps there were temporal geometries, angles in time, corners in duration, that predated and threatened linear experience. Lovecraft did not use physics to explain his horrors. He used physics to make them feel plausible. The result was a body of work that treated impossible spaces not as fantasy settings, but as reported phenomena. Lovecraft's narrators are academics, surveyors, antiquarians, people trained to observe and document. They encounter these dimensions not through magical portals, but through archaeological excavation, mathematical research, and the study of texts that should never have been written. This documentary impulse, the insistence on presenting the impossible as something discovered rather than imagined, is perhaps Lovecraft's most influential innovation. It transformed dimensional horror from a literary effect into something that felt and continues to feel like suppressed evidence. The 7 dimensions we are examining in this account emerged from this tradition. Some were Lovecraft's invention. Others were contributed by correspondents and collaborators, Frank Belknap Long, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, who cross-referenced each other's impossible geographies until a shared atlas began to take shape. No single author controlled the map. It grew through correspondence, through shared publication in Weird Tales magazine, through the deliberate interweaving of invented mythologies. By the mid-1930s, the map described a cosmos in which our familiar three-dimensional space was merely a thin, fragile surface stretched over an abyss of hostile geometries. The creatures that populated this cosmos, Cthulhu, Azathoth, the Migo, the Hounds of Tindalos, were secondary. The primary horror was always the spaces themselves, the places that should not exist, but, according to an expanding body of fictional evidence, do. The idea that there are places human beings should not go, places that exist outside the boundaries of the known world and operate according to alien rules, is as old as recorded thought. Lovecraft's 7 dimensions did not emerge from nothing. They are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back through Western esotericism, classical philosophy, and ancient cosmology to some of the earliest attempts to describe the structure of existence. What changed in the 20th century was not the idea itself, but its framing. The forbidden dimensions ceased to be theological, places of punishment or spiritual trial, and became structural. They exist not because a god willed them, but because reality is built that way. This shift from moral geography to geometric horror is the foundation of everything we are examining. The Sumerians described the Kur, a land beneath the earth from which no traveler returns. The Norse mapped Niflheim, a primordial realm of ice and mist that existed before the gods themselves. Greek mythology placed Tartarus not merely beneath the earth, but beneath Hades, a pit beneath the underworld, so deep that an anvil dropped from its rim would fall for 9 days. These are not simply bad places. They are places defined by their relationship to normal reality. They are below it, outside it, prior to it. They share a structural feature with Lovecraft's dimensions. They are defined by what they violate about the world above. The Gnostic tradition offers the closest ancient parallel to cosmic horror's dimensional architecture. 2nd century Gnostic cosmologies described the material world as a flawed creation, a deficient copy produced by a blind, ignorant deity called the demiurge. Beyond this flawed world lay the pleroma, the fullness of true divine reality. But between the pleroma and the material world lay the kenoma, the deficiency, a realm of emptiness and error. The kenoma is strikingly similar to the interstitial spaces of cosmic horror, a zone between dimensions, defined not by what it contains, but by what it lacks. The Gnostics feared it. Lovecraft's inheritors populated it with things that watch through the cracks. Plato's allegory of the cave is typically read as an optimistic parable. Prisoners chained in darkness, mistaking shadows for reality, who can be liberated by turning toward the light. Cosmic horror inverts this structure completely. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the cave is not a prison from which we can escape into truth. The cave is a shelter, and what lies outside it is not illumination, but geometries that destroy the minds that perceive them. The prisoners are not ignorant. They are protected. Their chains are not oppression, but mercy. This inversion, knowledge as threat rather than liberation, is the philosophical engine that drives every dimension we have cataloged. It also places Lovecraft in a direct, if adversarial, relationship with the entire Western philosophical tradition, from Plato through the Enlightenment. The occult context of the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided more immediate, raw material. Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, popularized the concept of nested dimensional planes, astral planes, etheric planes, planes of consciousness stacked like geological strata. Lovecraft despised Theosophy's spiritual optimism, but borrowed its architecture freely. The dreamlands owe their tiered structure to theosophical models of ascending and descending planes. The court of Azathoth occupies the position that Theosophy reserved for the divine source, the highest plane, the origin of all emanation, but fills it with blind chaos instead of cosmic intelligence. Lovecraft's dimensions are theosophical architecture emptied of meaning and repurposed as existential threat. The mathematical revolution of the 19th century provided the final essential ingredient. In the 1820s and 1830s, Nikolai Lobachevsky and Janos Bolyai independently demonstrated that Euclid's geometry was not the only internally consistent geometric system. Bernhard Riemann extended this work in the 1850s, describing geometries of curved spaces that obeyed entirely different rules. These discoveries shattered a 2,000-year assumption that Euclidean geometry described the necessary structure of space. It did not. It described one possible structure among many. For mathematicians, this was liberating. For writers like Lovecraft, it was terrifying. If Euclidean space was merely one option, then non-Euclidean spaces were not impossible. They were alternatives. And there was no guarantee that those alternatives were compatible with human consciousness. Relier's wrong angles are built directly on this mathematical foundation. The city is not impossible, It is simply non-Euclidean. And that, as Lovecraft understood, is far worse than impossible. Lovecraft's most powerful weapon was never a creature. It was an adjective. The word non-Euclidean appears across his major works, in The Call of Cthulhu, in The Dreams in the Witch House, in At the Mountains of Madness. And each time it carries a weight far beyond its mathematical meaning. In mathematics, non-Euclidean is a neutral descriptor. It refers to geometries in which Euclid's parallel postulate does not hold. In Lovecraft's hands, it became shorthand for a specific and devastating idea, that the spatial framework human beings depend on for basic cognitive function is local, contingent, and fragile. The word bridges the gap between technical precision and existential dread. It sounds scientific. It feels like a diagnosis. The broader vocabulary of dimensional horror repays close attention. Across the mythos, certain spatial terms recur with the force of incantations. Angles, curves, between, outside, beyond. These are ordinary prepositions and geometric nouns. In cosmic horror, they become threats. Consider how fundamentally the word between changes meaning when applied to the interstitial spaces. In daily usage, between implies two stable reference with empty space separating them. Nah, The Dreams in the Witch House. Between describes a populated, hostile, actively malevolent zone that separates dimensions from each other. The preposition has not changed. Our understanding of what can occupy the space it describes has changed entirely. The names Lovecraft assigned to his dimensions and entities follow a deliberate phonetic strategy. R'lyeh, Yugoth, Leng, Kadath, Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep. These words are constructed to resist comfortable pronunciation. Lovecraft addressed this directly in Correspondence, noting that the names of his invented entities were meant to approximate sounds produced by vocal anatomies fundamentally different from the human. The names of places follow the same principle. R'lyeh forces an awkward glottal transition that English speakers instinctively resist. Yugoth combines a soft opening with a hard, abrupt closure. These are not arbitrary choices. They are designed to make the listener's mouth feel briefly wrong, to produce, at the level of phonetics, a small-scale version of the perceptual distortion the dimensions themselves inflict. The rhetoric of indescribability is perhaps the most analyzed feature of Lovecraft's prose. His narrators constantly fail to describe what they encounter. R'lyeh's geometry is abnormal and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. The court of Azathoth involves amorphous dancers and monotonous piping. These are not failures of imagination. They are a deliberate semiotic strategy. Language is a system mapped to human sensory experience. Euclidean experience produces Euclidean language, words for up, down, left, right, near, far. When a narrator encounters a non-Euclidean space, the language mapped to Euclidean experience stops working. Indescribability is not Lovecraft avoiding the hard work of description. It is Lovecraft demonstrating that description itself, the fundamental act of translating perception into words, collapses in the presence of these dimensions. There is a meaningful distinction between the words dimension, world, and plane that cosmic horror exploits with precision. A world can be mapped, explored, colonized. It implies a geography compatible with human activity. A plane suggests flatness, extent, a surface one might walk across. A dimension, however, implies a direction of existence, an axis along which reality extends that may or may not be perceptible to human senses. When Lovecraft and his successors describe their impossible spaces as dimensions rather than worlds, they invoke this distinction deliberately. You can choose not to visit a world. You cannot choose to be exempt from a dimension. A dimension is not somewhere else. It is a direction that exists whether or not you can perceive it. The interstitial spaces are not a distant country. They are a direction you have never been able to point toward, but which has always been pointing at you. One further linguistic observation before we proceed. Lovecraft's narrators frequently describe their encounters with these dimensions using the language of translation, as if what they perceive is being rendered from an original that their senses cannot directly access. Wilcox's sculptures in The Call of Cthulhu are described as attempts to translate dream impressions of Relaye into physical form. Gilman's mathematics in The Dreams in the Witch House are described as a language capable of expressing spatial relationships that natural language cannot. The Necronomicon itself is presented as a translation, Abdul al-Hazred's attempt to render into Arabic what he perceived in dimensions that predated human language entirely. The implication is consistent. These dimensions have their own native language, their own geometric and spatial grammar, and every human account of them is a lossy translation. Something is always lost, and what is lost may be precisely the information that would allow us to understand what we are dealing with. The single, most important technique in cosmic horror's treatment of impossible dimensions is not atmosphere, not vocabulary, not the careful deployment of indescribability. It is format. Lovecraft and his circle understood something that most horror writers of their era did not. The container in which information is delivered determines how that information is received. A ghost story told around a campfire feels like entertainment. The same events described in a surveyor's report, a ship's log, or an academic paper feel like evidence. Cosmic horror's dimensions achieve their peculiar authority because they are almost never presented as stories. They are presented as documents. The Call of Cthulhu is structured as a found manuscript, the papers of a deceased professor, assembled and annotated by his grandnephew. It contains within it a police report, a transcript of a cult interrogation, and a sailor's sworn testimony. Each source approaches Arlaye from a different evidentiary angle, and each corroborates the others without fully explaining them. This is not narrative technique for its own sake. It is the deliberate simulation of how real, impossible phenomena would be documented, fragmentarily, from multiple unreliable perspectives, with gaps that no single witness can fill. The reader is placed in the position of a researcher confronting primary sources, not an audience being told a story. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, adopts the format of a geological expedition report. The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, is structured as an academic memoir. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, unfolds through a series of letters. In each case, the dimension being described, Antarctica's connection to Leng, the temporal dimensions accessed by the great race of Yith, Yuggoth, and the spaces beyond it, gains credibility from the bureaucratic sobriety of the format. These are not tales of wonder. They are reluctant disclosures by credentialed professionals who would very much prefer not to be believed, but who feel compelled by scholarly integrity to report what they have found. The collaborative dimension of the mythos amplified this documentary effect exponentially. When Lovecraft mentioned the Plateau of Leng, and Clark Ashton Smith subsequently referenced it in an unrelated story set on a different continent, and Robert E. Howard then alluded to it in a third context entirely, The effect was not mere cross-promotion. It was the simulation of consensus. Independent witnesses, writing from different perspectives and in different genres, were converging on the same impossible geography. This is precisely how real phenomena achieve acceptance, through independent corroboration. The Lovecraft circle, whether fully consciously or not, replicated this epistemological structure for places that do not exist. The fictional grimoires, the Necronomicon, the Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon, the Culte des Goules, serve a specific function in this architecture of authenticity. They are presented as primary sources within the fiction. They are the texts that document these dimensions directly, and they are referenced by the narrators, who are themselves presented as scholars, the way real academics reference real primary sources. This creates a layered documentary structure. The narrator's account references a grimoire, which references a dimension. Each layer adds apparent evidentiary weight. The reader is 3 removes from the original dimensional encounter, just as a historian studying a medieval chronicle is 3 removes from the events described. The fiction mimics the texture of genuine historical scholarship so precisely that it becomes, in a functional sense, indistinguishable. The consequence, after a century of accumulation, is remarkable. The fictional atlas of impossible dimensions has acquired the density of a real cartographic tradition. Rillier has specific coordinates. Leng has been debated in terms of its real-world analogs. The Necronomicon has been published in multiple editions by multiple authors, some sincere hoaxers and some deliberate satirists, blurring the line between fictional reference and physical artifact. Internet communities have mapped mythos locations onto real geography using satellite data. The fiction is not merely influencing belief, it is colonizing the methods by which we establish geographical fact. The dimensions remain impossible, but the documentation of their impossibility grows more detailed, more cross-referenced, and more formally rigorous with each passing decade. The map of places that should not exist is now, by volume and specificity, more detailed than the maps of many places that do. Every civilization builds its understanding of existence on a handful of unspoken assumptions. Space is continuous. Time moves forward. Geometry behaves consistently. Consciousness stays inside the skull. Location is fixed. A thing is either here or there, never both. These are not scientific theories. They are the cognitive bedrock that allows human beings to function without screaming. Cosmic horror dimensions exist to remove that bedrock, one assumption at a time. What makes the 7 dimensions we are examining so effective as philosophical instruments is their specificity. Each one targets a different foundational assumption and demonstrates, with terrible patience, what happens when that assumption fails. The dreamlands violate the boundary between consciousness and geography. In Lovecraft's cycle of dream stories, particularly The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, sleep is not a state of mind, but a mode of transport. The dreamlands possess consistent topography, seas, cities, mountains, underworlds. Multiple dreamers can visit the same locations and corroborate their experiences. This is not metaphor. Within the logic of the mythos, consciousness is a place. And if consciousness is a place, it can be invaded, occupied, and destroyed, while the body lies motionless in bed. Every night, you travel somewhere. The dreamland suggests that somewhere has teeth. The angles of Tindalos violate the relationship between geometry and safety. Frank Belknap Long established in 1929 that organic life exists in curves. the smooth, rounded geometries of nature. The hounds of Tyndalos exist in angles. They can reach any point in space-time that contains a sharp corner. Consider the room you are sitting in. Count the right angles. Every junction of wall and ceiling, every corner of every window frame, is a potential point of entry for something that has been waiting since before biological life chose the curve over the line. This dimension weaponizes architecture itself. R'lyeh violates Euclidean spatial coherence. The plateau of Leng violates the fixity of location. These are related but distinct transgressions. R'lyeh is a single place whose internal geometry does not obey the rules that govern every other place humans have encountered. Its surfaces behave impossibly, its distances shift, its angles lead in directions that should not exist. Leng, by contrast, is a place that refuses to stay put. Lovecraft located it in Central Asia, in the Dreamlands, and in Antarctica across different stories. Rather than treating this as carelessness, we should treat it as the defining characteristic. Leng exists wherever the membrane between dimensions grows thin. It is less a location than a condition. The Court of Azathoth violates causality and meaning at their source. At the center of Lovecraft's cosmos sits not a god of wisdom, justice, or love, but a blind, idiot deity surrounded by amorphous dancers and the thin, monotonous piping of demonic flutes. This is the nucleus of all reality, and it is mindless. Every other cosmology places consciousness at the center. Brahman, the Logos, YHWH. Lovecraft places entropy there instead. The court is not a place of punishment or reward. It is a place where the concept of purpose was never present to begin with. Yugoth, meanwhile, violates the boundary between the known cosmos and whatever lies beyond it, a frozen outpost at the edge of the solar system that functions as the last checkpoint before geometries become entirely incompatible with human perception. The seventh violation may be the worst. The interstitial spaces, the cracks between all other dimensions, violate the assumption that reality has a solid floor. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Lovecraft describes spaces between dimensions that are not empty, but populated. In From Beyond, a machine reveals entities that have always existed alongside us in frequencies we cannot perceive. If the spaces between dimensions are inhabited, then every stable reality is an island in an ocean of hostile void. There is no foundation beneath us. There never was. Immanuel Kant argued that space and time are structures of the human mind, not features of external reality. These seven dimensions test that claim to destruction. They ask, what happens when you enter a space your mind cannot structure? The answer, across a century of cosmic horror literature, is consistent. The mind does not adapt. It breaks. Lord Dunsany built the first modern dream geography in The Gods of Pagana, 1905, and A Dreamer's Tales, 1910. Mythological landscapes authored with the weight of real cartography. Lovecraft admired Dunsany intensely and constructed the dreamlands in direct conversation with his work. But where Dunsany's dream worlds carried the melancholy of fading beauty, Lovecraft's carried something colder. The dreamlands of the Cthulhu mythos are structured in descending tiers. The surface is deceptively beautiful, the city of Celophaeus, the enchanted wood, the Ukranos River. Beneath that surface lies the underworld. Beneath the underworld lie the vaults of Zin, and patrolling every boundary are the night gaunts, faceless, rubbery creatures that carry dreamers to places they did not choose to visit. The key to understanding the dreamlands as a horror dimension lies in their accessibility. Almost anyone can reach them through deep sleep. Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's most prominent dreamer, enters the dreamlands repeatedly across multiple stories. The Silver Key, 1926. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927. Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934. Carter's journeys are often framed as romantic quests. But the romance is a trap. The dreamlands are ultimately governed by the other gods, Nyarlathotep among them, who regard human dreamers with something between amusement and contempt. You may explore the dreamlands. You may even build cities there, but you do not own what you build, and the landlords are not kind. What makes this dimension philosophically disturbing is the erosion of waking authority. If the dreamlands are real, and within the mythos, their consistency across multiple dreamers confirms that they are, then waking life has no special claim to primacy. You spend a third of your life asleep. During that time, according to the logic of cosmic horror, you are somewhere. The dreamland suggests that the border between real and unreal is not a wall, but a membrane, and that membrane is permeable in both directions. Things from the dreamlands can follow you back. Ideas encountered in dream geography can reshape waking perception. The implication is quietly devastating. You have never been safe in your own bed. Dimension 2. The Angles of Tindalos, where time has corners. Frank Belknap Long published The Hounds of Tindalos in Weird Tales in March 1929. The story follows Halpin Chalmers, a writer who uses a drug called liao to project his consciousness backward through time. What Chalmers discovers is not the past as we understand it. He encounters a primordial division, a fork in the nature of reality itself. All organic life, all natural processes, all curved and flowing things descend from one branch. The hounds descend from the other. They are creatures of pure angularity, and they are hungry. They are drawn to anyone who has glimpsed them across time, and they pursue their prey through the angles of physical space, any corner, any sharp junction of surfaces. The hounds can emerge from there. Long's contribution to cosmic horror is underappreciated. He did not invent a monster that inhabits a scary place. He invented a monster that inhabits a geometric principle. The Hounds of Tindalos are not somewhere else. They are in the concept of angularity itself, a concept embedded in every room, every building, every city humans have ever constructed. Lovecraft built horror from scale and indifference. Long built it from shape. The practical implication within the story is claustrophobic. Chalmers attempts to survive by plastering over every corner in his apartment, creating a curved space with no angular entry points. He fails. There is always an angle somewhere. The horror of Tindalos is the horror of inescapable geometry, the realization that the shapes we use to build civilization are also the doors through which something ancient can reach us. The deeper philosophical layer concerns the nature of time. Long suggests that the hounds exist in angular time, a form of temporal experience that does not flow smoothly but corners, turning sharply in ways organic consciousness cannot follow. Linear time, the kind we experience, is revealed as a local phenomenon, one way of moving through duration, and not the oldest way. The hounds predate biology. They predate curves. They remember a universe built entirely of edges, and they want it back. Dimension 3. The Plateau of Leng, the place that is everywhere. Leng first appears in Lovecraft's Celiphies, 1920, as a location in the Dreamlands, a cold, high plateau inhabited by unpleasant beings. In The Hound, 1924, Leng is referenced in connection with Central Asian corpse cults. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, Lang is identified with a region of Antarctica. These are not the same place. That is precisely the point. Lang does not have a fixed location because Lang is not, in any conventional sense, a location. It is a condition, a state that geography enters when the boundary between dimensions begins to erode. Wherever the world grows thin enough, Lang is what bleeds through. The inhabitants of Lang reinforce its nature as a liminal space. The men of Lang are described as satyr-like beings, almost human but fundamentally wrong. The high priest not to be described sits in a monastery on Lang, wearing a yellow silken mask, a detail that connects Lang to Robert W. Chambers' King in Yellow mythology and the phantom city of Carcosa. Enormous spiders of alien intelligence weave webs across Lang's surface. None of these beings belong to a single mythological tradition. They are accumulated from multiple sources, multiple dream logics, as if Lang collects the refuse of other dimensions. The philosophical horror of Lang is the horror of unstable ground, not metaphorically, but literally. If a place can exist simultaneously in Tibet, Antarctica, and the Dreamlands, then the coordinate system we use to organize reality is a polite fiction. Latitude and longitude assume that each point on Earth is unique and fixed. Lang demonstrates that some places are neither. Celtic tradition speaks of thin places, where the boundary between worlds is permeable. Tibetan Buddhism describes hidden valleys, Bayul, that exist outside normal geography. Lang is what these traditions are pointing at, stripped of their spiritual comfort and reduced to its bare spatial horror. The ground beneath your feet may not be where you think it is. Dimension 4. R'lyeh, the city that thinks in wrong angles. R'lyeh is the most famous location in cosmic horror, and it is almost universally misunderstood. Popular culture remembers it as the place where Cthulhu sleeps. This is accurate, but misleading, like describing Auschwitz as a place in Poland. R'lyeh's horror is not its occupant. Its horror is its architecture. When Lovecraft describes R'lyeh in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, he devotes more language to the city's geometry than to the entity that rises from it. The sailors who briefly walk its surface experience nausea, perceptual distortion, and a fundamental inability to determine basic spatial relationships. A surface that appears convex behaves as though concave. An angle that should be acute somehow exceeds 180 degrees. One sailor falls to his death on what appears to be a level surface. Lovecraft's specific language deserves close attention. He describes R'lyeh's architecture as loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. The word redolent is critical. It means suggestive of, reminiscent of. R'lyeh does not fully exist in another dimension. It suggests other dimensions. It is a place where our geometry and some other geometry overlap imperfectly, producing a space that is neither fully ours nor fully alien. This is more disturbing than a wholly alien dimension would be, because it means our R'lyeh exists at a point of contact. It is where our spatial rules and something else's spatial rules collide, and neither set functions properly. The philosophical implication cuts deep. Euclidean geometry is not merely a mathematical system. It is the spatial framework that allows human consciousness to function. We navigate the world by assuming that parallel lines do not meet, that the angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees, that distance is consistent. R'lyeh demonstrates that these assumptions are local. They apply here, in our thin slice of reality. Elsewhere, and elsewhere may be closer than we think, perhaps submerged beneath the Pacific at coordinates 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west. Geometry follows other rules entirely, rules that are not merely different, but actively hostile to the human mind's attempt to process them. Dimension 5, the court of Azathoth, the center that is nothing. Every major cosmology places something meaningful at the center of existence. Hinduism places Brahman, pure consciousness. Christianity places the Logos, divine reason. Greek philosophy places the nous, cosmic mind. Lovecraft places Azathoth. Azathoth is blind. Azathoth is mindless. Azathoth writhes in chaos at the center of ultimate infinity, attended by amorphous dancers and the thin, monotonous whine of accursed flutes. This is not a god in any functional sense. This is the nucleus of all reality, and it is an idiot. The court of Azathoth is less a dimension than a revelation. It is the place you reach when you strip away every comforting layer of the cosmos, matter, energy, natural law, even space and time themselves, and look at what remains. What remains is purposeless motion and meaningless sound. Lovecraft described Azathoth most fully in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and the fragment Azathoth, begun in 1922. And in both cases, the emphasis falls on the piping, the ceaseless, monotonous flute music that accompanies the blind god's writhing. Several scholars have connected this image to Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will, a blind, purposeless force that drives all existence without direction or meaning. Lovecraft read Schopenhauer. The connection is likely deliberate. What makes the court the most philosophically terrifying dimension on this list is its position. It is not at the edge of reality. It is at the center. The other 6 dimensions we are examining can be avoided, at least in theory. You can refuse to dream deeply. You can round off your corners. You can stay away from Antarctica, but you cannot escape the center of existence. If the court of Azathoth is what occupies that center, then meaninglessness is not an absence at the heart of things. It is a presence. It sits there. It pipes. And every structure, every law, every mind in the cosmos is an ephemeral pattern forming and dissolving on its surface, signifying nothing. Dimension 6. Yuggoth, the dark at the edge. Yuggoth occupies a peculiar position in Lovecraft's geography. It is the most physically real of the 7 dimensions. Identified explicitly with Pluto in Lovecraft's sonnet cycle, Fungi from Yuggoth, 1930, and the story The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931. Pluto had been discovered by Clyde Tombaugh only in February 1930, and Lovecraft incorporated it into his mythology almost immediately. Yuggoth is a cold, dark world covered in alien fungi, used as a mining outpost and way station by the Migo, the fungoid beings Lovecraft borrowed from Himalayan mythology and reimagined as interstellar colonists. The horror of Yuggoth is not what it is, but what it borders. Yuggoth sits at the edge of the known solar system, and the Migo use it as the last staging point before traveling into regions of space where the physical laws governing our solar system begin to break down. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the Migo offer human collaborators a remarkable proposition. They will remove the human brain from its body, place it in a metal cylinder equipped with sensory apparatus, and transport it to Yuggoth and beyond. The brain will survive. It will perceive, but it will perceive things that the human body was never meant to contain. This is not death. It is something Lovecraft frames as considerably worse, forced consciousness in dimensions where consciousness was never supposed to operate. Yuggoth functions as a threshold. On one side, the known cosmos, governed by physics we understand, populated by matter we recognize. On the other side, the outer dark, where Azathoth's court lurks, and where geometry itself becomes negotiable. The mygo travel freely between both sides. Humans, even as preserved brains in jars, cannot make that crossing without fundamental cognitive damage. Yuggoth is the dimension that marks the limit of human adaptability, the point beyond which our minds cannot be modified, upgraded, or preserved enough to survive what they would encounter. It is the last place we can go and still be, in any meaningful sense, ourselves. Dimension 7. The interstitial spaces. The cracks between everything. The seventh dimension is not a single location. It has no name, no coordinates, no mythology specific to itself. It is the space between all other spaces, the gaps between dimensions, the cracks in the structure of reality through which things that should not exist have always been leaking. Lovecraft explored this concept most directly in two stories. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, Walter Gilman, a mathematics student at Miskatonic University, discovers that sufficiently advanced geometry can describe paths between dimensions. These paths are not empty. Gilman travels through spaces filled with prisms of alien light and angled voids that contain entities with no analog in normal biology. The witch Keziah Mason achieved the same travel 3 centuries earlier through methods indistinguishable from black magic. The implication is staggering. Mathematics and witchcraft are two languages describing the same impossible geography. In From Beyond, 1920, the physicist Crawford Tillinghast builds a machine that stimulates the pineal gland, allowing perception of entities that exist in frequencies normally invisible to humans. These entities are already here. They have always been here. They occupy the interstitial spaces between the wavelengths our senses can detect. Tillinghast's machine does not summon them. It simply removes the mercy of our blindness. The interstitial spaces represent the final and most comprehensive violation. The other 6 dimensions are, in some sense, contained. They are somewhere, even if that somewhere is the center of chaos or the edge of the solar system. The interstitial spaces are everywhere. They are the gaps between the atoms in your wall, the cracks between one second and the next, the unmapped frequencies between the colors you can see. If these spaces are real and inhabited, then reality has no solid floor, no sealed walls, no unbroken surface. Everything is porous. Everything is watched through the cracks. And the only reason you have not noticed is that your senses were built, perhaps mercifully, to look the other way. The consistent pattern across a century of cosmic horror literature is this. Humans who encounter these dimensions do not simply die. Death would be a kindness. Instead, they go mad. And their madness follows a remarkably specific trajectory that reveals something important about what these dimensions actually do to human cognition. The mind is a modeling system. It takes sensory data and constructs a workable representation of the environment, a model that allows the organism to navigate, predict, and survive. This modeling system evolved over millions of years to handle the specific parameters of Earth's environment: 3 spatial dimensions, forward-flowing time, Euclidean geometry at human scales. The 7 dimensions we have cataloged do not merely exceed these parameters, they contradict them. When the mind receives data from Arlia, surfaces that are simultaneously convex and concave, or from the angles of Tindalos, temporal directions that corner rather than flow, the modeling system does not produce an error message. It produces madness. The system does not fail gracefully. It fails catastrophically because it was never designed to handle input from outside its operational range. Lovecraft understood this intuitively. His characters who encounter dimensional anomalies do not become generically crazy. They develop specific symptoms that correspond to the specific dimension they encountered. Henry Wilcox, the artist in The Call of Cthulhu, who dreams of R'lyeh, begins producing sculptures in geometries he cannot explain. His hands model what his conscious mind cannot process. Walter Gilman in The Dreams in the Witch House loses the ability to distinguish mathematical abstraction from physical space. His equations become corridors he physically walks through. Halpin Chalmers in The Hounds of Tindalos becomes obsessed with eliminating angles from his environment, plastering over corners in a desperate attempt to seal the entry points he has made visible. Each madness is a specific cognitive adaptation to a specific impossible input. The most disturbing recurring element is what scholars call accurate madness, the suggestion that the mad are not wrong. They have perceived something real. Their madness is the correct cognitive response to correct information. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee spends 5 years in what appears to be a dissociative fugue. When he recovers, he has fragmented memories of inhabiting an alien body in a pre-human civilization, the great race of Yith, who swap consciousnesses across time. Peaslee is diagnosed as mentally ill. Then he finds physical evidence, his own handwriting in a manuscript buried for millions of years, confirming that his delusions were memories of actual events. His madness was sanity. The doctors were the ones who were wrong. This inversion, madness as accurate perception, is the engine that drives cosmic horror's relationship with these dimensions. It creates an epistemic trap with no exit. If you encounter one of these dimensions and go mad, you are dismissed as insane. If you encounter one of these dimensions and don't go mad, you have either failed to perceive what was actually there, or you have adapted in ways that separate you from the rest of humanity as surely as madness would. There is no outcome in which dimensional contact leaves a person both sane and unchanged. The dimensions do not merely threaten the body, they threaten the coherence of the self, the ability to construct a stable model of reality and live inside it. Once that model has been broken by exposure to geometries, it cannot process, it cannot be fully reassembled. The cracks remain, and through the cracks, as we have established, things are always watching, a final observation before we proceed. In most horror traditions, the victim's suffering serves a narrative purpose, punishment for transgression, a test of virtue, a lesson for the audience. In cosmic horror, madness serves no purpose at all. The dimensions do not drive people mad as punishment. They do not intend harm. They simply exist in configurations that the human mind cannot survive encountering. The madness is incidental. The dimensions would be exactly as they are, whether humans perceive them or not. This is perhaps the cruelest element of all. Not that these places destroy minds, but that the destruction is accidental. We are not important enough to be targeted. We are simply too fragile to look. There is a peculiar structural feature shared by nearly every story involving these 7 dimensions. The protagonist does not stumble into them by accident. They research their way there. Knowledge in cosmic horror is not a tool for navigating dangerous dimensions. Knowledge is the pathway to those dimensions. Study is approach. Understanding is exposure. The library is the gateway. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, is the most famous example of this principle. It does not merely describe Arlia, the court of Azathoth, or the spaces between dimensions. According to the internal logic of the mythos, reading those descriptions brings the reader closer to the places described. This is not metaphor. In the Dunwich Horror, 1929, characters who consult the Necronomicon gain the ability to perceive and interact with entities from other dimensions. The book functions as a cognitive key. It reconfigures the reader's perceptual apparatus to receive input from dimensional frequencies normally filtered out by the brain. The knowledge does not point to the dimension. The knowledge is the dimension, encoded in language, waiting to be decoded by a sufficiently attentive mind. This creates what we might call the epistemic trap of cosmic horror. You cannot study these dimensions safely because the study itself constitutes exposure. Every accurate piece of information about Arlia's geometry brings Arlia's geometry marginally closer to your perceptual field. Every correct equation describing the interstitial spaces opens those spaces fractionally wider. Walter Gilman's mathematics do not merely model the paths between dimensions. They create those paths. Or, more precisely, they make Gilman permeable to paths that were always there. The distinction between knowing about a dangerous place and being in a dangerous place collapses. The map and the territory merge. Lovecraft was not the only writer to recognize this structure. Algernon Blackwood explored it in The Willows, 1907, where two travelers gradually realize that their analytical attention to the strange phenomena around them is drawing those phenomena closer. Arthur Macon's The White People, 1904, presents a young girl's diary in which the act of recording encounters with another dimension deepens and accelerates those encounters. Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, 1895, built an entire mythology around a fictional play whose second act drives readers insane, not through graphic content, but through the transmission of dimensional knowledge that the human mind cannot safely contain. In each case, the mechanism is identical. Knowledge is not a defense against these dimensions. Knowledge is the infection vector. The implications extend beyond fiction into genuine epistemological territory. The philosopher Eugene Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, 2011, argues that cosmic horror reveals a fundamental limit to human knowledge, not a limit of quantity. There are things we haven't learned yet, but a limit of kind. There are things we are structurally incapable of learning without being destroyed by the learning. The 7 dimensions we have cataloged are, in Thacker's framework, objects of what he calls the world without us, aspects of reality that exist independently of human perception and that cannot be integrated into human understanding without breaking that understanding apart. The forbidden nature of this knowledge is not a moral prohibition. No God has forbidden it. It is a structural incompatibility, like running software on hardware that cannot support it. The program does not merely fail, it destroys the machine. We should note, with appropriate scholarly discomfort, that we are participating in the very structure we have just described. This examination of 7 impossible dimensions is itself an act of cartography, a mapping of places that, within the logic of cosmic horror, punish being mapped. Every description we have offered, every analysis we have provided, operates according to the same principle the Necronomicon embodies: the translation of impossible geography into communicable language. If the epistemic trap is real, and within the genre it always is, then the audience is already implicated. You did not stumble into this by accident. You chose to learn about places that should not exist. And now you know slightly more about them than you did before. Whether that knowledge has brought those places fractionally closer is, of course, a question the genre leaves deliberately unanswered. The map grows. The cartographer continues. And somewhere in the angles of the room, something may or may not have shifted. The impossible dimensions of cosmic horror did not spring fully formed from Lovecraft's imagination. They were assembled across decades from fragments scattered throughout late 19th and early 20th century weird fiction, a slow accumulation of spatial anxieties that Lovecraft synthesized into a coherent cosmological framework. Tracing the ancestry of these dimensions reveals how deeply the fear of wrong places is embedded in the modern literary imagination, and how many writers independently arrived at the same disturbing conclusion, that the space we inhabit may be a thin, provisional arrangement surrounded by alternatives that are hostile to human life. Robert W. Chambers published The King in Yellow in 1895, and in doing so, created what may be the first modern dimensional weapon disguised as literature. The collection revolves around a fictional play whose second act drives readers to madness. The play references Carcosa, a city first named by Ambrose Bierce in An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886. But Chambers transformed it from Bierce's ambiguous ruin into something more radical, a place that reaches through the text to damage the reader. Carcosa is never fully described. It does not need to be. Its power lies in the fact that it exists in a dimension accessible through language itself. The play is not about Carcosa. The play is a doorway to Carcosa. This concept, text as dimensional gateway, would become foundational to Lovecraft's treatment of the Necronomicon, and through it, to every dimension the grimoire describes. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, introduced a different ancestral strand, the thin place rendered with documentary precision. Two travelers on the Danube find themselves on a small island where another dimension presses against ours. The willows move without wind. The ground shifts underfoot. The air carries sounds that do not belong to any natural source. Blackwood never names or explains the other dimension. He simply demonstrates its pressure, the way it deforms normal reality at the point of contact. Lovecraft called The Willows the greatest weird tale ever written. Its influence is visible in the Plateau of Leng, which functions as exactly this kind of thin place, a location where another dimension has worn the fabric of our world nearly transparent. William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland, 1908, pushed the concept further. The novel describes a house that exists at the intersection of dimensions, a fixed point through which the narrator perceives cosmic vistas of planetary death, encounters pig-like entities from another plane, and eventually witnesses the heat death of the solar system. Hodgson's house is arguably the first architectural dimensional horror in literature, a physical structure that serves as an interface between incompatible realities. The connection to R'lyeh is direct. Both are built structures whose geometry mediates between human space and something fundamentally alien. Both produce perceptual distortion in human observers. Hodgson demonstrated that a building could be a dimensional event, and Lovecraft took the lesson to its ultimate conclusion. Lord Dunsany's The Gods of Pagana, 1905, and A Dreamer's Tales, 1910, contributed the third essential ingredient. Authored mythological geography treated with the weight of real cartography. Dunsany invented entire cosmologies, gods, cities, rivers, afterlives, and presented them not as allegories, but as places with specific topographies and histories. His dreamlands were melancholy and beautiful, tinged with the sadness of things that exist only in imagination. Lovecraft inherited Dunsany's technique wholesale, but stripped it of its gentle melancholy. The dreamlands of the Cthulhu mythos retain Dunsany's geographic specificity, the same insistence on named cities, mapped rivers, describable terrain, but add a layer of menace that Dunsany never intended. The beauty remains, but beneath it, Nightgaunt's patrol and the other gods wait. The founding of Weird Tales magazine in 1923 created the ecosystem in which these scattered anxieties could consolidate into a shared tradition. Before Weird Tales, writers of dimensional horror worked in Isolation, Bierce in San Francisco, Blackwood in London, Hodgson at sea. Weird Tales placed them and their inheritors in a shared publication context where cross-referencing became possible and then inevitable. When Lovecraft mentioned Lang and Frank Belknap, Long subsequently referenced it. Readers of the same magazine noticed the convergence. When Clark Ashton Smith set stories in Hyperborea and Lovecraft acknowledged Hyperborea in his own fiction, the impossible geography gained the texture of independent corroboration. Weird Tales did not merely publish cosmic horror. It created the conditions under which a collaborative atlas of impossible dimensions could be drawn. One story, one reference, one shared place, name at a time. The Call of Cthulhu is the story that made cosmic horror a recognizable genre, and its most enduring contribution is not its titular entity, but the 6 pages in which human beings attempt to walk on the surface of Arlaia. Those pages contain some of the most disorienting prose in 20th century fiction, not because of what they describe, but because of how systematically they dismantle the reader's ability to visualize what is being described. R'lyeh is not merely an alien city. It is a sustained assault on the reader's spatial imagination, and its narrative function is to demonstrate that architecture itself can be a form of violence. The story's 3-part structure operates as a triangulation. The first section, The Papers of Professor Angel, approaches R'lyeh through secondary evidence. A bas-relief sculpted by an artist during feverish dreams, newspaper accounts of mass hysteria, the records of a police raid on a Louisiana swamp cult. The second section, Inspector Legrasse's testimony, documents the cult that worships whatever waits in Arlaie, providing the theological framework without direct encounter. The third section, the Johansen narrative, provides the encounter itself, told through the recovered journal of a Norwegian sailor whose ship stumbled upon R'lyeh when the sunken city briefly rose above the Pacific. Each section increases the evidentiary proximity to R'lyeh while simultaneously making the dimension less comprehensible. More data produces less understanding. This is the epistemic structure of the story, and it mirrors the epistemic structure of the dimension it describes. The Johansen narrative demands close reading. When the sailors make landfall on Arlaia, Lovecraft's prose undergoes a specific transformation. His normally verbose, adjective-heavy style becomes halting and contradictory. The sailors encounter a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror. The phrase tangible substance is critical. Lovecraft insists on R'lyeh's physical reality, even as he describes features that should not physically coexist. Surfaces that appear convex behave as concave. An angle of masonry that shouldn't have been there leads in a direction the narrator cannot name. One sailor Donovan slides down a surface and is swallowed up, not by water or a pit, but by the geometry itself. The city consumes him through its own architecture. The single most influential sentence in the passage, arguably in all of cosmic horror, is Lovecraft's observation that the geometry of the place was all wrong. 6 words that converted architecture from shelter to threat. The sentence works because it is simultaneously precise and incomprehensible. We understand what wrong means when applied to geometry. We cannot, however, visualize wrong geometry. The sentence creates a conceptual space that the imagination cannot fill, and that empty space is where the horror lives. Every subsequent attempt to depict non-Euclidean architecture in fiction, film, or games, from Clive Barker's Le Marchand configuration to the oldest house in Control to the shimmer in Annihilation, descends from this sentence and from the problem it poses. How do you represent a space that, by definition, resists representation? Lovecraft's treatment of Cthulhu's emergence from Ar-Liye is, by comparison, almost anticlimactic, and this is structurally deliberate. The entity is described in broad, impressionistic terms. A mountain walked or stumbled. The thing cannot be described. After the meticulous spatial horror of Ar-Liye's surface, Cthulhu registers as almost a relief, a thing, however monstrous, that can be perceived as a discrete object with a shape. R'lyeh offers no such comfort. It is not an object. It is an environment, and the environment is wrong in ways that Cthulhu, as a mere entity, cannot match. This is the story's deepest insight. The container is more frightening than the contained. The city is worse than the god that sleeps in it. The story's influence on the treatment of dimensional horror cannot be overstated. Before The Call of Cthulhu, alien dimensions in weird fiction were typically described as vaguely other, strange, dreamlike, uncanny. After it, the genre had a specific and replicable technique for conveying spatial wrongness. Describe architecture in terms that the reader's visual imagination cannot reconcile. Give precise geometric details that contradict each other. Use the language of physical observation, angles, surfaces, distances, but make the observations internally inconsistent. R'lyeh taught a generation of writers that the most effective way to depict an impossible dimension is not to obscure it with fog and shadows, but to describe it clearly and specifically in terms that the mind cannot assemble into a coherent image. Clarity, not obscurity, is the instrument of spatial horror. The more precisely you describe the wrongness, the more violently the reader's imagination fails. If The Call of Cthulhu established the impossible dimension as a place you might physically encounter, The Dreams in the Witch House established something arguably more disturbing, the impossible dimension as a place you might calculate your way into. The story follows Walter Gilman, a mathematics student at Miskatonic University in Arkham, who rents a room in a centuries-old house once inhabited by the witch Keziah Mason. Gilman's advanced studies in non-Euclidean geometry and quantum mechanics begin to converge with the spatial properties of his strangely angled garret room, and he discovers, or the dimensions discover him, that the spaces between dimensions are real, navigable, and not empty. Keziah Mason provides the historical anchor. Arrested during the Salem witch trials of 1692, Mason reportedly escaped her cell by drawing curves and angles on the prison walls, and then walking through them into spaces that the physical architecture of the cell did not contain. This detail is essential to the story's philosophical architecture. Mason achieved dimensional travel through intuitive geometric knowledge 3 centuries before Gilman approached the same territory through formal mathematics. The implication is that the interstitial spaces have always been accessible. The method of access, whether you call it witchcraft or topology, is secondary. The spaces do not care what language you use to describe them. They simply require that the description be accurate enough to function as a key. Gilman's experiences in the interstitial spaces are among the most viscerally disorienting passages Lovecraft ever wrote. He describes abysses whose material and gravitational properties he could not even begin to explain. Half-seen, vaguely anthropoid shapes that moved through spaces at angles he could not determine, and corridors of alien-angled geometry where his body seemed to follow paths that his conscious mind could not map. The dimensional travel is not mystical transportation. It is physical movement through spaces that obey non-Euclidean rules. Gilman's body goes where his equations point. His mind cannot follow. The gap between what his mathematics describes and what his consciousness can process is where the horror lives. The figure of Brown Jenkin, Keziah Mason's familiar, described as a rat-like creature with a sharp-featured, bearded human face, embodies the biological horror of the interstitial spaces. Brown Jenkin is not from any known dimension. It is from between dimensions, a creature that evolved or was produced in the cracks between stable realities. Its biology is impossible by the standards of any single dimension. It exists because the interstitial spaces, despite being gaps in the structure of reality, have their own ecology. Things live there, things breed there, things that combine features from multiple dimensional frameworks in ways that should not cohere but, in the cracks, somehow do. Brown Jenkin is a small horror, but it is proof of a much larger one. The spaces between dimensions are not sterile voids. They are habitats. The story's deepest thesis is stated almost casually, that sufficiently advanced mathematics is indistinguishable from witchcraft. Gilman's equations and Keziah Mason's inscribed curves describe the same paths through the same impossible spaces. The only difference is notation. This is a profoundly unsettling equivalence. It means that the interstitial spaces are not supernatural. They are mathematical, features of reality's structure that can be accessed by anyone with sufficient geometric knowledge. The barrier between our dimension and the cracks between dimensions is not a mystical seal or a divine prohibition. It is an ignorance barrier. It holds only as long as we do not learn enough to breach it. Every advance in geometry, every refinement of our understanding of spatial relationships, brings us incrementally closer to the spaces that Keziah Mason reached through scrawled curves on a prison wall. Lovecraft wrote The Dreams in the Witch House in 1933, during a period of intense interest in the implications of quantum mechanics and higher dimensional mathematics. The story has aged with remarkable potency. Modern string theory proposes that reality contains 10 or 11 spatial dimensions, most of them compactified, curled so tightly that they are imperceptible at human scales. The question the story poses has only grown more relevant. If those compactified dimensions exist, what is in them? Are they empty geometric abstractions? Or are they, as Lovecraft suggested, spaces with their own properties, their own inhabitants, their own terrible ecology? Physics does not yet have an answer. The Dreams in the Witch House proposed 190 years ago, and nothing in the intervening decades has made it less plausible. The interstitial spaces wait, the equations approach, and the barrier of ignorance, such as it is, grows thinner with every passing year. Lovecraft died in 1937. The dimensions did not. Within a decade of his death, the atlas of impossible spaces he had sketched was being expanded, contested, and fundamentally reshaped by writers who inherited his geography, but not necessarily his philosophy. The history of cosmic horror's dimensions after Lovecraft is a history of tension between two impulses: the impulse to systematize the impossible, to make it comprehensible and therefore manageable, and the impulse to deepen it, to push the horror further into territories Lovecraft himself never reached. That tension has produced some of the genre's greatest achievements and its most instructive failures. August Derleth, Lovecraft's most devoted posthumous champion and the founder of Arkham House Publishing, was also the most aggressive systematizer. Derleth organized Lovecraft's loosely associated entities into a structured pantheon with elemental correspondences: Cthulhu as water, Cthugha as fire, Ithaqua as air, Nyarlathotep as earth. He imposed a moral framework of elder gods versus great old ones that mapped roughly onto Christian concepts of good and evil. And he attempted to fix the dimensions into a coherent cosmological hierarchy: the dreamlands here, R'lyeh there, Azathoth at the top, everything in its proper place. The scholarly consensus is that this systematization, however well-intentioned, domesticated the horror. Lovecraft's dimensions are terrifying precisely because they resist taxonomy. When Derleth assigned them elemental labels and hierarchical positions, he converted cosmic horror into dark fantasy. The dimensions became settings rather than violations. Clark Ashton Smith took the opposite approach. Rather than organizing Lovecraft's existing dimensions, Smith created entirely new ones and set them not in alien space, but in deep time. Hyperborea, Zothique, Poseidonis. These are not other dimensions in the spatial sense, but temporal dimensions, civilizations that existed millions of years before humanity, and that left behind ruins, artifacts, and spatial distortions that still warp the present. Smith's contribution was the dimension of time as a form of cosmic horror. In his Zothique stories, the Earth's final continent exists under a dying sun, where magic has replaced science, and the distinction between the living and the dead has become negotiable. The horror is not that there are spaces beyond our own, but that our own space has a history so deep and so alien that we are latecomers in a world saturated with the residue of incomprehensible predecessors. Ramsey Campbell, writing from the 1960s onward, demonstrated that Lovecraft's dimensions were not geographically limited to New England. Campbell relocated cosmic horror to England's Severn Valley and the streets of Liverpool, showing that the interstitial spaces could bleed through anywhere. His early stories, collected in The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, closely imitated Lovecraft's style. His mature work developed a distinctive approach to dimensional horror. The wrong space is not discovered through research or exploration, but through accumulating wrongness in ordinary environments. A street that feels slightly too long. A building whose interior dimensions do not match its exterior. A corner of a familiar room that seems, for just a moment, to contain a direction that was not there yesterday. Campbell brought the dimensions home. His work suggests that the atlas of impossible spaces is not confined to remote islands, frozen plateaus, or the centers of cosmic chaos. It is embedded in the everyday, waiting for attention to make it visible. Thomas Ligotti, beginning in the 1980s, took the philosophical implications of cosmic horror's dimensions to their logical and most disturbing conclusion. In Ligotti's work, particularly the stories collected in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1986, and Grimscribe, 1991, and the non-fiction treatise The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, the impossible dimension is not somewhere else. It is here. Reality itself is the wrong dimension. Consciousness itself is the horror. Ligotti does not describe alien geometries or sunken cities. He describes the experience of being alive in a universe that has no purpose, and he treats that experience as itself a form of dimensional entrapment. The implication is stark. You do not need to find Relia or calculate your way into the interstitial spaces. You are already in the wrong place. You were born there. You have never been anywhere else. The most significant contemporary expansion of Lovecraft's dimensional atlas is not a single author's work, but a collective project, the SCP Foundation. Begun in 2007 as a collaborative fiction wiki, the SCP Foundation has produced thousands of entries documenting anomalous objects, entities, and spaces, each presented in the format of a classified containment report. Many of these entries describe dimensions that extend, complicate, or directly reference Lovecraft's geography. SCP-2935 describes an extra-dimensional space where all life has instantaneously died. SCP-3001 documents a researcher trapped in a dimension with nearly zero Hume levels, a space so ontologically thin that reality itself barely functions. SCP-354 is a lake that serves as a portal to a dimension from which increasingly hostile entities emerge. The Foundation's contribution is not merely volume, though its volume is staggering. It is the perfection of Lovecraft's documentary technique. Every impossible dimension is presented in clinical, bureaucratic prose, complete with containment protocols, incident logs, and cross-references. The format insists, with institutional authority, that these dimensions are real, documented, and being actively managed by a vast secret organization. The fiction has evolved beyond the found manuscript. It now simulates an entire institutional apparatus dedicated to the suppression of dimensional knowledge. The map is no longer drawn by isolated scholars. It is maintained by a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies, as we know, outlive the individuals who created them. Fiction, when it is sufficiently detailed and sufficiently consistent, develops a gravitational pull on reality. This is not metaphor. It is a documented cultural phenomenon, and cosmic horror's impossible dimensions provide some of the most striking examples in modern literary history. The 7 dimensions we have cataloged were invented. They were published in pulp magazines, elaborated in personal correspondence, and expanded through collaborative fiction. None of them are real, and yet, across the past century, each has accumulated a body of evidence, hoaxes, coincidences, misidentifications, and sincere belief that blurs the boundary between invented geography and reported experience in ways that Lovecraft himself might have found uncomfortably familiar. The Necronomicon is the most obvious case. Lovecraft invented the book entirely. He said so repeatedly in correspondence, with increasing exasperation throughout the 1930s. It did not matter. By the 1970s, multiple authentic editions had been published. The most commercially successful, the Simon Necronomicon, released in 1977 by an anonymous author claiming Sumerian and Babylonian sources, has sold over 1 million copies. Practicing occultists have used its rituals to contact entities from dimensions Lovecraft fabricated from whole cloth. Some report success. The ontological status of these reports is less interesting than their structural function. They demonstrate that a fictional atlas, if sufficiently detailed, can generate experiential data that its users treat as confirmation. The map produces the territory it claims to describe. Relier's coordinates present a different kind of escape from fiction. Lovecraft placed his sunken city at approximately 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west in the South Pacific. These coordinates fall near the oceanic pole of inaccessibility. Point Nemo, the single point on Earth's surface most distant from any land. Lovecraft almost certainly did not know this when he chose the location. The coincidence is, by any rational measure, meaningless. It has not been treated as meaningless. Internet communities have mapped Relia onto satellite imagery. Conspiracy theorists have noted the proximity to Point Nemo with the reverence of archaeologists confirming a site prediction. In 1997, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded an ultra-low frequency underwater sound, dubbed the bloop, originating from a location roughly concordant with Relier's coordinates. NOAA later attributed the sound to glacial calving. By that point, the association was permanent. The bloop became evidence of Cthulhu's stirring, not because anyone seriously believed it was, but because the fictional atlas had already claimed that patch of ocean so thoroughly that any anomalous data from the region was automatically absorbed into the mythos. The plateau of Leng has undergone a subtler form of reality colonization. Lovecraft's placement of Leng in Central Asia intersected with a pre-existing body of Western esoteric speculation about Tibet. Blavatsky's Hidden Masters, the legend of Shambhala, the theosophical concept of secret valleys containing preserved ancient knowledge. These traditions predate Lovecraft by decades, but Lovecraft's Leng has retroactively contaminated them. Contemporary esoteric communities that discuss astral travel to hidden Tibetan plateaus are, whether they acknowledge it or not, navigating a geography that Lovecraft's fiction has partly overwritten. The real Tibet and the fictional Leng now occupy overlapping cultural space, and separating them requires a degree of literary historical awareness that most casual readers of esoteric literature do not possess. Sleep paralysis provides perhaps the most psychologically interesting point of contact between fictional dimensions and reported experience. The condition, temporary immobility upon waking or falling asleep, frequently accompanied by the perception of a malevolent presence, visual and auditory hallucinations, and the sensation of being in a place that is not one's bedroom, maps disturbingly well onto Lovecraft's dreamlands. Sufferers report environments with wrong proportions, entities that observe without communicating, and a pervasive sense that the space they occupy is not the space their body lies in. Clinical neuroscience explains these experiences as artifacts of disrupted REM atonia. The explanation is almost certainly correct. It is also, from the perspective of cultural studies, incomplete. Lovecraft's dreamlands have provided a narrative framework for interpreting sleep paralysis that competes with the clinical one, and for some sufferers, the fictional framework feels more accurate to their experience than the medical one. The dimensions are not real, but the experiences that map onto them are, and the fiction has shaped how those experiences are understood. The broader pattern is worth naming directly. Cosmic horror's impossible dimensions have escaped their textual origins, not because people are credulous, but because the fiction was designed, deliberately and with extraordinary craft, to mimic the evidentiary texture of real geographical knowledge. Lovecraft gave coordinates, He cited sources. He cross-referenced. His collaborators corroborated. The result is a body of fictional cartography so formally rigorous that it interfaces with reality at multiple contact points. Coincidental coordinates, ambiguous acoustic data, pre-existing esoteric traditions, neurological phenomena that lack satisfying narrative frameworks. The dimensions are not real, but reality keeps producing data that fits them. Whether this says something about the power of fiction, the structure of reality, or the human compulsion to find pattern in noise, is a question this account will leave, deliberately, unanswered. Literature can describe an impossible dimension. It can tell you that the geometry is wrong, that the angles lead in directions that should not exist, that the space resists comprehension. What literature cannot do is make you look at it. The translation of cosmic horror's dimensions into visual and interactive media has therefore posed a unique artistic problem. How do you depict a space that is defined by its resistance to depiction? The history of dimensional horror in film, games, and music is largely a history of creative solutions to this problem, some brilliant, some instructive in their failure, all revealing something about the limits and possibilities of different media when confronted with the fundamentally unrepresentable. Film has struggled most visibly with the challenge. Paul W. S. Anderson's Event Horizon, 1997, represents one of the earliest serious attempts to put a cosmic horror dimension on screen. The film's premise, a spacecraft equipped with an experimental gravity drive that opens a gateway to a dimension beyond normal space, is essentially a dramatization of the interstitial spaces. The ship travels through the cracks between dimensions and comes back wrong. What the crew encounters is rendered through body horror, hallucination, and the production design of the ship's interior, which grows increasingly non-functional as the film progresses. The film's most quoted line, Sam Neill's, "Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see," captures the essential insight. The dimension it depicts is hostile specifically to visual perception. The solution is imperfect but honest. Anderson acknowledged that the dimension cannot be shown directly, and instead showed its effects on human bodies and human architecture. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, found a more sophisticated solution. The Shimmer, an expanding zone of alien influence in which biological and physical laws become fluid, functions as a cinematic plateau of Leng. It is a place where location is unstable, where the boundaries between organisms dissolve, where the geometry of living things becomes negotiable. Garland's key insight was to depict dimensional wrongness not through impossible architecture, but through impossible biology. Flowers that grow in human shapes, trees made of crystal, a bear that screams with its victim's voice. The Shimmer is not non-Euclidean in the geometric sense. It is non-Euclidean in the biological sense, and this translation from spatial horror to organic horror proved remarkably effective on screen. The audience cannot see wrong angles, but they can see a deer with flowers growing from its antlers, and the wrongness registers. Video games have achieved what film largely cannot. They have made dimensional horror interactive. From Software's Bloodborne, 2015, remains the most critically celebrated example. The game begins as gothic horror, werewolves, mad villagers, fog-shrouded streets. Midway through, the player acquires a stat called Insight, and the game transforms. Entities that were always present, but invisible, become visible. The architecture shifts. A boss called Amygdala, an enormous spider-like being clinging to the side of a cathedral, has been there since the beginning of the game. but the player could not see it until their insight reached a threshold. This is a mechanical enactment of cosmic horror's core premise. The dimensions are already here, and perception is the only barrier. Bloodborne does not transport the player to another dimension. It reveals that the player has been in one all along. Remedy Entertainment's Control, 2019, took a different approach, constructing an entire game around the concept of dimensional architecture. The Oldest House, the game's primary setting, is a brutalist skyscraper in Manhattan, whose interior does not correspond to its exterior. Rooms shift, corridors extend into impossible distances. The astral plane, a dimension accessed through moments of crisis, is a vast, abstract space of geometric platforms floating in darkness. Control succeeds by treating dimensional instability not as a climactic revelation, but as an ongoing environmental condition. The player navigates wrong spaces for the entire duration of the game, and the wrongness becomes normalized, which is, in its own way, more disturbing than any single moment of revelation could be. The dimension is not a destination, it is where you work. Music has contributed something that neither literature, film, nor games can provide: the sound of impossible dimensions. The dark ambient genre, pioneered by artists like Lustmord, whose album The Place Where the Black Stars Hang, 1994, was explicitly inspired by cosmic horror, attempts to create auditory environments that suggest vast, alien, inhospitable spaces. The technique relies on extremely low-frequency drones, reversed and processed field recordings, and the strategic use of silence to create a sense of immense, occupied emptiness. Cryo Chamber, a record label dedicated to dark ambient, and Lovecraftian Soundscapes, has released collaborative albums titled Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, and Cthulhu, each designed as an extended auditory portrait of the relevant dimension. The connection to Lovecraft's own emphasis on sound is direct. The Court of Azathoth is defined not by its appearance, but by its piping, the thin, monotonous flute music that accompanies the blind god's writhing. Dark ambient artists have taken this cue and built an entire sonic vocabulary for dimensional horror. You cannot see the Court of Azathoth, but you can, if you listen to the right recordings in a dark enough room, hear something that approximates it. Whether this constitutes an act of artistic interpretation or something closer to Tillinghast's resonator, a device that adjusts human perception to frequencies it was not meant to detect, is a question the genre leaves productively unresolved. Lovecraft's dimensions have escaped not only their fictional origins, but their literary context. Entirely. Over the past 4 decades, they have been claimed, reinterpreted, and repurposed by communities that Lovecraft could not have anticipated, and, in several cases, would not have welcomed. The impossible geography he sketched in Weird Tales has become contested intellectual territory, fought over by occultists who treat it as functional spiritual cartography, philosophers who treat it as conceptual art, academics who treat it as cultural artifact, and marginalized writers who have stripped it of its creator's bigotry while preserving its existential power. The question of who owns these dimensions and what it means to own a place that should not exist reveals as much about contemporary culture as it does about cosmic horror. The Chaos Magic community was among the first to appropriate Lovecraft's dimensions as functional spaces. Peter Carroll, in Liber, Null, and Psychonaut, 1987, argued that the ontological status of magical entities is irrelevant. What matters is whether they produce results when invoked. Phil Hines' The Pseudonomicon, 1994, applied this principle directly to Lovecraftian entities and dimensions providing rituals for contacting beings from spaces Lovecraft invented as fiction. The philosophical position is more sophisticated than it initially appears. Chaos magicians do not necessarily believe R'lyeh physically exists at the bottom of the Pacific. They believe that the concept of R'lyeh, when engaged with sufficient imaginative intensity, produces genuine altered states of consciousness that are functionally indistinguishable from contact with an external dimension. Whether the dimension is real or imagined is, in this framework, a distinction without a difference. The map produces the experience of the territory regardless of whether the territory exists independently. Academic engagement with Lovecraft's dimensions has intensified dramatically since the early 2000s. S.T. Joshi's biographical and critical work established the scholarly foundation. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, Lovecraft, and Philosophy, 2012, argued that Lovecraft's prose style, particularly his insistence on describing objects that resist description, constitutes a form of philosophical argument about the nature of reality. Harmon treated R'lyeh's impossible geometry and the interstitial spaces not as fictional settings, but as philosophical objects, thought experiments about what exists beyond human access. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, went further, arguing that cosmic horror's dimensions represent the world without us, reality as it exists independently of human perception, which is by definition inaccessible and hostile to human cognition. These are not literary critics treating horror as entertainment. They are philosophers treating horror as evidence. The speculative realism movement, a loose philosophical grouping including Quentin Melassu, Ray Brassier, and Harmon himself, has drawn explicitly on cosmic horror as a literary precedent for its central claim that reality is fundamentally alien to human thought. Melassu's concept of hyperchaos, the idea that the laws of nature could change without reason at any moment, echoes the court of Azathoth, where causality and meaning dissolve into purposeless flux. Brassier's Nihil Unbound, 2007, argues for a universe that is, at its most fundamental level, indifferent to the existence of minds, a position that Lovecraft articulated through fiction 7 decades earlier. The relationship between cosmic horror and speculative realism is not influence in the traditional sense. It is convergence. The fiction and the philosophy arrived at the same conclusion through different methods, that the space we inhabit is a local, contingent, and deeply fragile arrangement, surrounded by alternatives that are not merely indifferent to us, but structurally incompatible with our continued cognitive integrity. The question of Lovecraft's racism cannot be separated from the history of his dimensions, and responsible scholarship does not attempt to separate them. Lovecraft's documented bigotry, his fear of racial mixing, his anxiety about immigration, his reflexive horror at cultural difference, inflects his cosmic horror in ways that scholars have extensively analyzed. The alien dimensions may partly encode xenophobic anxieties, the fear that unfamiliar geometries, unfamiliar languages, and unfamiliar bodies represent existential threats. This reading does not invalidate the dimensions as philosophical objects, but it does complicate them. Modern writers of color have engaged this complication directly and productively. Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, retells Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black protagonist, reclaiming the dimensional horror while exposing the racism that shaped it. P. Djeli Clark's Afro-futurist fiction reimagines cosmic horrors geography through non-Western cosmological frameworks. Nalo Hopkinson and N.K. Jemisin have built dimensional architectures that carry the existential weight of Lovecraft's best work without replicating his worst impulses. The dimensions survive their creator's bigotry, not unchanged, but transformed by hands that reshape the map while preserving its capacity to terrify. One final appropriation deserves mention. The internet itself functions in ways that were not anticipated, but now seem obvious as an interstitial space. It is not a physical location. It has no geography in the traditional sense. Yet it contains communities, economies, dangers, and knowledge, including knowledge that damages those who encounter it. It is accessible from any point in physical space. It exists between the physical locations of its users, in infrastructure that is largely invisible and rarely considered. Dark web forums, memetic hazards, information that cannot be unseen, communities organized around shared delusions that acquire the weight of consensus reality. These are not metaphorical parallels to Lovecraft's dimensions. They are structural parallels. The interstitial spaces, as Lovecraft described them, are populated gaps between stable realities, accessible through specialized knowledge, containing entities and information that the unprepared mind cannot safely process. The internet meets every criterion on that list. Whether Lovecraft was describing a technological future he could not have foreseen, or articulating a permanent feature of reality that technology merely made newly visible, is, like most questions in cosmic horror, a matter of how much comfort you are willing to sacrifice for an answer. We have spent a considerable number of words describing places that do not exist. The natural question, the question a sensible person would ask at this point, is, why do they matter? They are fictional. They were invented by a racist recluse in Providence. Rhode Island, expanded by his pen friends, and elaborated by subsequent generations of horror writers, game designers, and musicians. None of the 7 dimensions are real. R'lyeh is not at the bottom of the Pacific. The hounds of Tindalos do not watch from the corners of your room. Azathoth does not pipe mindlessly at the center of infinity. These are stories. Why, after a century, do they continue to disturb? The answer begins with a finding from experimental psychology that has no direct connection to horror literature, but illuminates it powerfully. Research into spatial cognition, conducted at institutions including University College London and MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences through the 2010s, has demonstrated that the human brain maintains an internal model of spatial reality that is remarkably rigid and remarkably fragile. The model is rigid in that it enforces Euclidean expectations, even when sensory data contradicts them. It is fragile in that when those expectations are sufficiently violated through virtual reality environments with impossible geometry, through optical illusions that break spatial coherence, the result is not mild confusion, but acute physiological distress, nausea, panic, dissociation. The brain does not calmly update its spatial model. It revolts. Cosmic horror's dimensions are effective because they target this specific cognitive vulnerability. They describe spaces that would trigger exactly this response, not as metaphor, but as neurological prediction. Modern physics has not made these dimensions less plausible. It has made them more so. The standard model of cosmology now holds that approximately 95% of the universe's total mass energy content consists of dark matter and dark energy, substances that do not interact with light, cannot be directly observed, and whose nature remains fundamentally unknown. String theory proposes 10 or 11 spatial dimensions, most of them compactified below the scale of observation. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that every quantum event generates branching realities, each as physically real as our own. None of these scientific frameworks confirm Lovecraft's fictional geography, but they confirm something arguably more disturbing: that the space we perceive and inhabit is a vanishingly small fraction of what exists. We live in a thin, bright slice of a cosmos that is overwhelmingly dark, overwhelmingly alien, and overwhelmingly inaccessible to human senses. The 7 dimensions are fiction. The condition they describe, human consciousness trapped in a tiny habitable zone surrounded by incomprehensible vastness, is not. The anthropic principle, in its standard formulation, offers comfort. It observes that the universe's physical constants appear fine-tuned for the emergence of conscious life, that we exist because the cosmos happens to be configured in one of the vanishingly rare arrangements that permits our existence. Cosmic horror inverts this principle with surgical precision. The universe is not fine-tuned for us. We are fine-tuned for an unimaginably narrow band of the universe. Step outside that band, into non-Euclidean geometry, into angular time, into the compactified dimensions, into the spaces between spaces, and we do not merely die. We cease to be coherent. Our consciousness, our spatial modeling, our very selfhood depends on conditions that are local, temporary, and on a cosmic scale, vanishingly rare. The 7 dimensions are literary expressions of this inversion. They ask, what lies outside the habitable zone of human cognition? The answer, across a century of fiction, philosophy, and increasingly physics, is almost everything. The deepest reason these dimensions persist in the cultural imagination may be the simplest. They articulate a fear that is older than literature, older than philosophy, older than language itself. The fear that the ground is not solid. Every civilization has built its cognitive architecture on the assumption that space is reliable, that the geometry of the world is consistent, that location is fixed, that the boundaries between here and there, between real and unreal, between self and void, will hold. The 7 dimensions we have cataloged are 7 demonstrations that this assumption is, at best, provisional. The Dreamlands suggests that consciousness is a place that can be invaded. Tyndalos suggests that geometry is a threat. Leng suggests that location is an illusion. Relie suggests that architecture can be hostile. The Court of Azathoth suggests that the center of everything is nothing. Yugoth suggests that the edge of the known is a threshold to the incomprehensible. And the interstitial spaces suggest that between everything stable, something watches through the cracks. These are not beliefs, they are suspicions, and suspicions, unlike beliefs, cannot be refuted, because they make no definitive claims, they merely suggest. They gesture toward the walls of the room you are sitting in, and whisper that the angles where those walls meet are not as simple as they appear. They note that you will sleep tonight, and that sleep involves going somewhere, and that you have never been entirely sure where. They observe that mathematics continues to advance, that physics continues to discover dimensions beyond perception, that the map of what we do not know grows larger with every generation, while the territory of what we do know remains a bright, thin island in an ocean of dark. Lovecraft died in poverty in 1937, convinced that his work would be forgotten. Nearly a century later, his impossible geography is more detailed, more widely known, and more culturally embedded than the maps of most real nations. The 7 dimensions endure not because they are entertaining, though they are, but because they describe a structural anxiety that no amount of scientific progress can resolve. We live in a geometry that works for us. We have no guarantee it will continue to work. And somewhere, in the angles, in the cracks, in the spaces between the spaces, something that is not a monster and not a god and not a force, but simply a place that should not exist, continues, with infinite patience, to not care whether we believe in it or not. The thin, monotonous piping continues. It has always been playing. You are only now learning to hear it,